it sounds sort of kooky to conflate a ice plunging practice or, a fasting practice with your ability to emotionally regulate in a crisis, but they are very, very connected.
Absolutely.
Because what happens, in your ice plunge or on your meditation cushion actually begins to spill over and punctuate your life on a more quotidian basis. I know it's completely changed. Those practices have completely changed, like, how I show up as a parent, how I show up in traffic, how I show up in business or in relationships. So this is why I think it's important to lean into them.
Yeah. Well, Jeff Krasno, welcome to the podcast. I am so happy to sit down with you. I had the pleasure of meeting you recently at your phenomenal event, New Luminescence, with your wife.
That's right.
And it was this event, I think you had 1,500 women that were there to learn more about health and longevity. And I was impressed by it, to say the least. But one thing that I know about you, you're a community builder. And what we're going to talk about is obviously good stress today. But I think one of the things I would love to know from you, being that you come from Wonderlust and Commune, is the benefits of being in community. And I would love to hear from you. How do you feel this benefits in our overall health? And considering we're in a loneliness crisis, can you kind of share the polar opposites of both?
Yeah, sure. Can I start with a funny story?
Yes, please.
Because this is actually serendipity and has nothing to do with anything that we'll talk about. So I have 3 daughters. I call them my estrogen footprint. And when they were little, like 13, 14 years ago, they were these like devious, treacherous little threesome creatures. And they would, do devious childlike things. And so my wife and I were like, oh my God, we were like a band of gypsies at that juncture because we were traveling with Wanderlust. And we're like, we really, really need some help. And so we're like, we need someone who's going to travel with us and someone help mind the kids and like help us with food and stuff like that. So we hired this woman and her name was Erica Lippi.
Wait, what?
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
Wait, nobody has a last name Lippi, by the way. This is like not common.
I know.
Okay, that's great.
So it's funny. Then she stayed with us for a couple of years, and then eventually my kids like drove her mad and she lost her mind. Not really. I'm still in touch with her. But anyways, it was very serendipitous when, I was like, started to learn about you and I was like, oh my God, that can't be the same Erica Lippi. Anyways, it's very funny.
I love that. Okay. That's
and of course I'll try to, build a bridge here between that and your question. Yeah. I mean, we are in a state of loneliness. I mean, there's all of this kind of study now about loneliness. There's a BYU study that came out, I think, by a woman named Julia Holdstad Lund, something sort of a officious name, but that essentially equated loneliness from an all-cause mortality perspective with smoking 15 cigarettes per day, or being an alcoholic. And so, loneliness, we think about it in a social context, but it has a really severe, acute physiological and psychological dimension to it. And we're lonelier than we've ever been. There's some stats that I researched. I believe 58% of Americans report eating every single meal alone. 58%.
Wow.
I had to like triple check that statistic because I couldn't quite believe it. And of course, this really flies in the face of how we evolved. If you were to map the entire course of human history across one single day, we lived in community for 23 hours and 54 minutes of it. So we are just simply not evolved to live in vertical boxes or in gated communities or single family homes. That is an artifact of modernity. And really that trend started to accelerate kind of after World War II with the development of kind of suburban neighborhoods where you essentially had to drive everywhere to get everything, in gated communities and et cetera. But now that's accelerated primarily by technology that allows us to kind of feel a sense of connection through digital tools and social media. But all the research points to the fact that that form of connection actually makes us feel more lonely and more distracted and more kind of anchored in comparison. And so this is why I believe community is more important than ever. I mean, if you actually analyze the etymology of that word community, it means with duty or with obligation. So when we're actually together in real life, we have a sense of accountability or obligation or duty to each other. And when you're just, throwing vitriolic barbs anonymously behind a digital keyboard, you just don't feel accountable to anyone. And this is why, I think, I sort of unwittingly have devoted a tremendous amount of my life towards creating or sort of fostering community or creating containers for it. And, I think what you saw and what we experienced even just this last weekend was, a kind of peak experience of community set against the context of, these ravaging fires that just happened here in Los Angeles, or people feeling very confused and tremendous amount of grief or collective grief
and
too.
Displaced.
And displacement for sure. And then, to stand in that lobby of that theater and watch people stream in the front door, kind of electrified and seeing their friends maybe for the first time, some of whom had been, very severely impacted by the fires, and seeing the embraces and the connections forged. It was like my 1 millionth reminder that fostering that form of community is an important thing to do.
Yeah. And I want to get deeper into this conversation, like circling back later on. But what we're going to go in today is about something that everybody's familiar with, which is stress. But of course, a lot of people don't know the benefits of actually stress, as you call it, good stress. We're familiar with the negative impacts, and that is very real. But you learned that there's a good stress that we actually should be willingly putting into our life. And so talking about, you speak about how modern comfort conflicts with our human biology, like as we, came from, where we came from. So if you could explain that a little bit deeper of why you discovered this and really what's happening as we pull away from it.
Yeah. Well, it's actually very connected to the concept of community. Like I said, we evolved in relationship to our environment for hundreds of thousands of years as Homo sapiens and millions of years as hominids before that. And we evolved within community. So, for example, it didn't mean that we didn't have conflict, but we had to solve our conflict face to face and work things out. And now, of course, modernity has hijacked that process. And that is the constant theme of modernity. It essentially, our culture, the way we live, hijacks our design, our engineering, our biology. And that is making us very, very sick. So if you really ask yourself the question and you delve into, like, how did I evolve? Well, I evolved with quite a bit of Paleolithic stress, I guess I would call it. And, these Paleolithic stressors were actually adaptive for human physiology and human psychology and even social connection. So, for example, it's like we evolved in relationship with some calorie paucity, right? So, there used to be a winter from a calorie perspective, and modernity has essentially eliminated winter from just a pure calorie perspective. So we would get, historically, as hunter-gatherers, a little fat in the late summer, early fall, and there was no Instagram, so there was no judgment around that. But actually, it was completely adaptive because the body then was preparing for winter's fallow. Winter's paucity of calories was just around the corner. And that paucity of calories not only kept us lean, I mean, there was zero obesity rate,
Right.
on the Serengeti 10,000 years ago, but it also activated all of these different physiological pathways that we are now understanding were incredibly adaptive. So for example, calorie paucity or calorie restriction would stimulate this pathway in the body that's known as AMPK, for example. That's a pathway in the body that's associated with repair and restoration. It's associated with this process called autophagy, where the body cleans up these senescent zombie cells, and we get to use those amino acid building blocks for new proteins and wonderful other compounds in our body. It also stimulated the production of new mitochondria, our energy power plants. So there were so many adaptive reasons to restrict calories. But then kind of after World War II, again, we started to apply this kind of military industrial complex to our food system, particularly to agriculture. And we started to create ultra-processed, shelf-stable, nutrient-deficient calories, in some ways for good reasons, to serve a growing population. Right. But the end effect of that is that you and I can, before the end of this podcast, we could order up Chick-fil-A on our phone, and DoorDash would bring it right here to Louisa, and we would, and essentially we have eliminated all of the obstacles between us and endless consumption of food. And that's just one example. There are so many others, Paleolithic stressors that were beneficial to health. For example, we were subject to nature's vicissitudes, these kind of massive fluctuations in temperature, for example. We would get really, really hot. We get really, really cold. And that actually turns out to be highly beneficial, both physiologically and psychologically. It activates all of these incredible proteins and upgrades metabolic health, et cetera. But now modernity has essentially hijacked that hard-wrought evolutionary advantage. And here we are. We sit in a thermoneutral 72-degree atmosphere, where there's a little digital thermostat on the wall. But guess what? We actually have a thermostat inside of us. It's called our hypothalamus, that's programmed to perspire in certain circumstances and to shiver in certain other circumstances, but we're not making use of that.
There's so many people that are just sitting in comfort all the time. And we know, probably more than half the world. So can you elaborate on this statement? You say chronic disease is a result of chronic ease, because we're really not made to be comfortable all the time.
No. It is occasionally delicious to lounge on the couch in that snuggly 72-degree atmosphere and binge Netflix and eat Chubby Hubby. And I won't say that I haven't done it. But that life of ease, that convenience, is leading to a lot of inconvenient truths and a lot of dis-ease. And certainly that's true with our modernized food system. We've created this always availability, as we talked about, of cheap calories. And that availability of calories provides us with this dopamine hit to assuage our psychological feelings of deficiency. So this is, often called people eating their feelings. And right. I was one of them. This was a huge part of my life. So when I felt deficient, or I wasn't living up to my expectations or the expectations of the world around me, or someone insulted me on Instagram, or I had a bad day, or the business wasn't going well, or whatever, and it was 9:00 at night, well, I could always assuage those emotional feelings by sort of meandering over to the pantry and grabbing a bag of chips. And that is really the curse of chronic ease, is because we know that doing that will cause a lot of dis-ease. It will contribute to obesity and diabetes and cardiovascular disease and Alzheimer's and all the big killers. And so that's just, one example of many, 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 modern conveniences that essentially hijack our biology. Our relationship with light, for example, is a huge one. Again, I love Curb Your Enthusiasm and Larry David. I love to binge that stuff, from time to time. But our access to 24-hour on-demand entertainment is hijacking our hormonal teeter-totter that is engineered in the body. So if you're taking in, blue light, particularly at night, you're disrupting that circadian rhythm, that delicate balance between cortisol, which is highly adaptive in the early part of the day, and melatonin, which is obviously very adaptive at night and induces a state of grogginess and sleep. But if we're taking in that blue light at night, we're throwing ourselves into imbalance. And that's really what chronic ease does. That's what modernity does. It creates imbalances in the human organism, whether that's neurotransmitter imbalances, hormonal imbalances, metabolic imbalances, lipid imbalances. And those imbalances then lead directly to disease.
Yeah, absolutely. So what would you say are some ways that this chronic ease or comfort that we seek is hurting us mentally, physically, and even spiritually?
Yeah. Well, I mean, physically, we're just always growing and never repairing. So, and this is very cultural. We celebrate and sanctify growth in our society. How big is your house and how big is GDP and how much money are you making on the top line and what's the Dow Jones? It's like always about growth, growth, growth. And we live in a culture where we physiologically are just growing, 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 growing because we never stop consuming. But if you look at all natural systems, and humans are part of natural systems, healthy systems are always characterized by this balance, again, this homeostasis between growth and repair. And so this is why it's so important now to self-impose deliberate good stress in order to realign ourselves with our engineering in order to foster balance. So again, this is, you can find so many different, examples of this. But for example, like never getting cold, what does that do to your emotional resilience? It really undermines your ability to put conscious top-down pressure on top of involuntary response. And I'll just kind of unwind that for a second. So if you get into a cold plunge, and I hate the cold, but this is now part of my daily regimen.
Yeah.
When you get into an ice bath, what happens? Right, you gasp. And then your body has a very normal, adaptive, bottom-up involuntary response. Epinephrine starts to course through your veins. I feel it generally in my neck, like my carotid arteries, and I start to feel like I'm going to have a panic attack. And then there's this brief space, this moment where you can apply, often through conscious breath, but also through leveraging your rational neo-mammalian brain, you can apply conscious top-down pressure on top of that involuntary bottom-up response. And you're like, no, I'm going to be okay. And yes, there are metabolic benefits to getting cold. There's dopamine benefits to getting cold. But in this particular case, the most potent benefit is that emotional resilience. Mm-hmm. It's that ability to emotionally regulate in the face of negative stimulus or chronic modern stress. And I think, we live in this moment that is characterized by bad stress. We are constantly bombarded with fear-based news, 24-hour news media, social media that is algorithmically preferenced to be hyperbolistic and sensationalist and scandalous. We're overworked, we're financially stressed. Some of us suffer from neglect and trauma and racism. So if we don't have that emotional resilience, that ability to emotionally regulate and bring ourselves back to center, we can just spin out.
Right.
And we end up experiencing these downward spirals. And you look at all of the mental health disorders that are happening right now, they are this caustic elixir of modernity's culture, which I just described, and are mixed with our inability to emotionally regulate.
That is so big. I think that's one of the key things I would love to dive a little deeper into is emotional resilience. Because, for example, we were talking offline about the LA fires, and we're both, near that area, you were evacuated. And a lot of people, of course, in a situation like that, so traumatic, of course, you're going to spin out and stress, like, what if this, what if that, all the things. And I think for somebody like you that does these good stress protocols, which we'll go into, you have prepared yourself to handle such stressful events, maybe not that particular ones you've ever experienced before, but you have the emotional resilience to then maybe look at the situation a different way. So I'm just curious, how did you handle that situation? And would you say if you didn't have these protocols that you implemented in your life, would you have been able to handle it the same way?
That's a good question. I tend to operate well in a crisis.
It's a great skill.
Yeah, like I always wanted the ball with 1 second left. I was like, give me that shot. Didn't make them all the time. In fact, I rarely made them, but I always wanted the ball. And I think some people are wired that way to thrive in periods of crisis. I've been through a number of environmental crises, and so for me, yes, that was a very, very acute and intense time in Los Angeles with the fires, the Palisades fire in particular, that threatened our property, and then the Sunset fire that threatened where I live, and so double evacuation in the course of a day. And this is, Erica, like really where, in some ways, sort of the spiritual rubber hits the hard, unforgiving asphalt of reality. Is like you build yourself up over years with practices, breathwork practices, meditation practices, even fasting practices that I believe actually are quite psychological and spiritual in nature. And then what is that practice for? Well, that practice isn't for, sitting in your meditation room on your cushion. That practice is really most useful in these moments of severe crisis. And so I think this is why it's so important to build up your toolkit of emotional regulation, while the sun is shining, right? I don't know. I can't remember that quote. I think JFK that said, the best time to fix your roof is when the sun is shining, right? And so this is why you build up these practices, because they're incredibly useful in that time of crisis. Now, for me particularly, we had built this 10-acre retreat property in Topanga, given how aggressive the winds were and the direction of the fire. I really had to surrender to what I felt was sort of the inevitable demise of that property. And really, it forced me to get very clear on why that property was so deeply important to me. And it wasn't for, the pots and pans or the couches. I mean, I have some old guitars there. Yeah, sure. It wasn't for the yoga cushions or whatever, everything that we have there. When I had to really examine really why I was feeling such emotional sadness around the potential loss, it really came down to the fact that this was a place where we had created a tremendous amount of community and connection. And we had built this container for all of these different amazing thought leaders to come in. We did all these masterminds and yoga retreats. And so in some ways it was like clarifying. It was like, what is the actual real important thing here? And so that's what I was sort of pre-mourning, if you will, was the potential loss of that characteristic, but not the physical place itself. But, this is why, again, I think, it sounds sort of kooky to conflate a ice plunging practice or, a fasting practice with your ability to emotionally regulate in a crisis, but they are very, very connected.
Absolutely.
Because what happens in your ice plunge or on your meditation cushion, actually begins to spill over and punctuate your life on a more quotidian basis. I know it's completely changed. Those practices have completely changed, like how I show up as a parent, how I show up in traffic, how I show up in business or in relationships. So this is why I think it's important to lean into them.
Yeah. And I think stress that most people, like the bad stress that people experience, is because they're attached to something and then they're like gripping so tight and they can't let go. And so surrender is obviously letting go. And so it's like practicing this detachment. And I think, like you said, in these protocols that you speak about, it's kind of like, nobody likes cold. Nobody likes getting into an ice bath. I've done it many times and I don't like it. And I actually do resist it a lot of times. I do cryotherapy now, and it's not that hard, but it's hard, right?
Right.
You could do it, but a lot of people resist it because they're like, oh, I just don't want to get cold. But then it's like, once you do it, you're like, wow, this is fine. I could handle it. And so it shows you like what you're capable of doing. And obviously then you're capable of handling something bigger.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah. Doing hard things makes doing other hard things easier.
Yeah.
And, this is why, I'm a big proponent of really just leaning into the edge of your discomfort. I would never recommend anyone listening or watching that if they've never ice plunged before, that they get into a 34-degree plunge. Don't do that. Don't. In fact, particularly as it pertains to cold, the temperature is very subjective. It will confer a ton of benefits if it just feels a little cold, even if that's at 60 degrees or 58 degrees. You don't have to get into a 40-degree ice plunge, and definitely don't start there. Start at the very edge of your discomfort and know that you're on a journey where you can lower the temperature and increase duration if you want to. And that goes with essentially any protocol. Nobody runs a marathon the first day they start running. They start slow and they build up. And it is that day after day commitment that yields just inestimable results. I mean, we so often associate health psychologically and physiologically with downward spirals, but upward spirals are completely available. And it doesn't take that long. If you start to understand your body's engineering and essentially swim with its current, your body is dying to heal, really. And those upward spirals are completely possible. And when you get in one, it is just the most marvelous feeling. It's addictive.
Well, you are a testament, because your health journey was exactly this, is really leaning into discomfort, and you started doing these good stress protocols. So what do you think was the biggest impact, like the biggest bang for your buck that you think that made the biggest shift in your life, especially in your health?
Yeah. So 5 years ago, I was suffering from an array of symptoms that are candidly like so anodyne and boring that I almost don't want to tell them, but it's like chronic fatigue and brain fog and irritability and the inability to concentrate and wicked insomnia and the need to like check my phone every 2 seconds. And then there were the more kind of insults to my vanity, if you will. I had like dad bod, I had that inner tube adiposity around the middle. My children love to point out my man boobs, more clinically known as gynecomastia. I started to develop these little like brown skin tags, like in my armpits, which, and sometimes you notice them on the back of people's necks. Those, I later found out that was, those were indications of insulin resistance and potentially type 2 diabetes. So I had this whole array of symptoms that are so normalized in society, but these symptoms are completely abnormal. 100 years ago, no one would have felt this way chronically, and certainly thousands of years ago, as we evolved on the savannah, essentially brain fog and chronic fatigue were just not concepts that were talked about. And, you know, the crazy thing is, as I discovered, is that these presentations that are so easy to write off as just like, oh, I'm just having a bad day, or just, you know, a little bit stressed, these are just upstream from what we label chronic disease. And that was my big unfortunate awakening, but sort of fortunate in retrospect, is that then I got diagnosed with diabetes. And I, you know, started to wear this little disc on my triceps. And for those people just listening, yeah, it's just a little disc that you self-apply, and it bounces data to an app. And you can essentially have a dashboard into your metabolic health, you know, through your blood glucose levels moment to moment. So I had very, very high blood glucose levels. They were essentially 125, 130 milligrams per deciliter fasting, which is on the very, very upper end of prediabetes and lower end of diabetes, with massive spikes postprandially. So after eating would go up to like 250, 300. And, you know, candidly, that just makes me kind of average in modern society, which is the sad thing. You know, 93% of Americans now are metabolically dysfunctional. 50%.
Can you repeat that?
Yeah. 93% of Americans are metabolically dysfunctional. And 50% have either diabetes or prediabetes. And of that prediabetes cohort, 90% don't know it.
Wow.
So they're just going to their PCP every year and they're getting their blood panels and, okay, you know, well, you're not diabetic yet. So they just don't really know. And then, you know, slowly, like a French film noir, you know, this chronic disease sneaks up on you and then you get a diagnosis. So that's kind of where I started. And, you know, fortunately, I have access to a lot of brilliant people, and I started my own podcast and started to interview any doctor and every doctor that would talk to me. And I started bringing them up to my place in Topanga and making content and courses with them. And over time, really distilling a lot of their wisdom and endless amount of me search. And, you know, my wife is like, what the hell are you doing on PubMed again tonight? Come to bed. You know, I was able to really understand a tremendous amount about my own physiology and start to apply these protocols, just get into my own petri dish and become my N of one. And, you know, so then there's a stack of them.
Yeah.
And I would say, you know, I was much, much heavier. I was about 210 pounds then. And I lost 65 pounds in a relatively short period of time. And that really started with a fasting protocol. So I started to, you know, become more interested in really just an intermittent fasting or time restricted eating. And just started very slow and followed that 16-8 protocol, essentially consolidating my consumption of food into an 8-hour window. That's where I could find like the most data. And at first I was actually pretty fundamentalist about it because I was in a pretty acute situation. And now I just kind of play with the edges of that. I don't always eat in a very tight 8-hour window. But the bigger concept here is that most of us eat in the opposite ratio. And if I was honest with myself, I was probably eating 16 hours a day, you know, and most Americans are that way. I mean, if you go to any fast food place or a Denny's or anything, you know, you'll see it's like breakfast served all day, lunch, dinner,
Right.
and late night. You know, we're basically eating 4 meals a day and snacking between it. And, you know, to my comment earlier, all we do is grow and we never repair when we're constantly just consuming. And I had to come to that realization where I needed to give my body an opportunity to rest and repair. Now, obviously, a time-restricted eating protocol can lead to a lot of weight loss and calorie restriction. Doesn't have to, because we could go and gorge 10 pizzas and 4 pints of ice cream in a very short period of time. But generally, when you start to make conscious choices about your life as it pertains to food, like adopting a 16-8 protocol, you then begin to make other conscious choices. So not only did I consolidate my consumption of food, but I stopped committing what I call carbicide.
Carbicide, I like that.
Which,
Awesome.
I was like a typical, American in that sense where, I'd have breakfast and what was available. Well, there's cereals and bagels and even like the healthy muffins. This was driving my blood glucose off the charts. And so I had to completely change that around. I became sort of quasi ketotarian. So like a very low glycemic, vegetable heavy diet. But then over time, starting to introduce more regeneratively raised meats, et cetera. And then really focused on fiber and protein in the morning. That was like my key. And so it was like that intermittent fasting protocol plus a protein focused diet. And I was really starting to see significant weight loss and blood sugar regulation, like management that was quite good. And then the big last kind of stack on that was the cold therapy, but in a very, very particular cadence and time. And I think this is something that people could be interested in trying if weight loss is important to them, which is the combination of those three. So essentially like a low carb diet, an intermittent fasting protocol, and then before you put the first bite of food in your mouth on any day, get into a cold plunge. And the mechanism behind that really does make sense. So if you get into a cold plunge, what's going to happen? Your core body temperature is going to plummet. And your body is, of course, miraculously engineered for homeostasis, for the Goldilocks zone. So it'll try to then warm your core body temperature back up into that warm porridge, if you will, of 98.6. But because I hadn't eaten in 15 and a half hours, and because I had a low glycemic, low carb diet, my mitochondria would start to look around and realize there's no glucose available to make energy, to make heat, to warm Jeff back up. So it had no choice but to oxidize fat and really use fat, break down triglycerides into free fatty acids and use that fat as that energy substrate to heat me back up. And so that combination of a keto-focused diet, intermittent fasting protocol, and then a cold plunging protocol before I broke my fast, I lost like 60 pounds in 2.5 months or something.
That's
crazy.
Remarkable. So anybody listening that is looking to lose some weight, that's definitely a good protocol. So,
and just caveat there is like, I'm a dude and an individual. And so there are different protocols for fasting and for cold as applied to women, and particularly women who are on their cycle, and for women who are menopausal. And so what I'm explaining, I think, has broad application, but I think everyone needs to learn about it themselves and then tweak per their own bio-individuality, specifically women, but everyone, because we're all different.
Absolutely. And I highly suggest listening to Mindy Pelps on that, fasting like a girl for women specifically. So I think there's a lot of people that, again, seek comfort and ease. And I think we're in a crisis, this comfort crisis. So if somebody listening right now is like, where do I start? What are these protocols? Give me them all. Obviously, we're touching on some of them, but where would you say is the easy place for somebody to start, like a tangible, no cost? I mean, what you're talking about is no cost, but like what would be the best place to start to implement to get yourself out of that comfort zone, because you can't grow in your comfort zone regardless. So
yeah. Oh, I think it's first taking a real honest inventory of your life. And also realizing that change is totally available to you. In fact, all we are is change. And so before you even start with the protocols, I think you have to embrace this notion that is very spiritual at its core. I mean, the Buddha intuited it 2,500 years ago under the Bodhi tree, that we essentially are completely impermanent beings. We're just changing moment to moment in relationship to our environment, period. And that was actually a big awakening for me, because I was a super chubby kid who would essentially do anything to fit in. And I was getting moved around from country to country as a kid and moving into new schools and new languages and new cliques. And I really carried that forward into my life and became just essentially a chronic people pleaser. And I really believed that, my fate was written in the stars of my genetics, and that I was just this chubby kid that would do anything to be liked, that always judged his value through the eyes of others. And that is essentially who I am. And the more I learned about human physiology and kind of looked under the hood, what I realized is like, no, actually I am 7 octillion atoms in this organism having 37 billion chemical reactions per second. I am simply not the same person that sat down with you half an hour ago, Erica, period. So change is not only possible, it is happening all of the time. And when you really fully grok and grasp that, you start to actually feel more empowered, because you then have agency over that trajectory of yourself as process. You can be moving towards wholeness. That's the process of healing. You can be moving moment to moment towards disconnection and disease. That's the process of ailing. And you really do have tremendous agency around your behaviors and the scaffolding of your environment to alter that trajectory. So that was kind of the first aha, before any fasting, before any cold plunging, etc. Realizing that change is available to you.
Yeah.
And so then you're like, okay, well, if really it's my behavior and my environment and not my genes that is primarily controlling my health, then what do I need to do about my environment and my behavior? And this is really when, the protocols and the practices become central. And so I think it's about kind of architecting your day for optimal success. And for me, I'll just share a little bit of part of it. And all of these things are completely free.
Yeah.
That's the amazing thing, is that, the model of spending endless money on yourself in the name of health. Okay, yeah, sure. I can get into like some of the devices
Right.
and the hyperbaric chambers and, some of the more bespoke, esoteric, red light therapy beds and PEMF and all this stuff. It's cool. I'm into it. But getting up early and getting light in the morning to set your circadian rhythm, essentially get outside and be in the natural environment for about 20 minutes, depending on the brightness of the sky, but let's just say 20 minutes.
That's the sweet spot, is the 20 minutes.
Yeah, it depends a little bit about how many lux there are coming from the sky. So on a bright day versus an overcast day, you might have to spend a little longer on an overcast day than on a bright day. Okay. But if you get out there in the morning, there's a certain band of the electromagnetic wave spectrum. This gets a little geeky, around 480 nanometers. It's called blue light. And it's the same band of light that emits from, your iPad or your computers, et cetera. But if you get that from the superior field, so the sky is up here in the superior field, into this certain part of your retina, in the inferior part of your retina, there are these little sensory neurons there. They've got a funky name, intrinsically sensitive neural ganglion cells or something like that, retinal ganglion cells. And those send a little signal kind of down this little cascade from that to your suprachiasmatic nucleus, to your pineal gland, et cetera, to produce melatonin about 14 hours later. That's what you want. And so that is the real reason why. Just get up in the morning, put on a little jumper or whatever, make your tea or make your coffee. And
take your dog for a walk.
Take your dog for a walk.
You do that anyways.
And get outside and enjoy nature and your natural surroundings. And it is also a form of kind of setting your intention for the day and being immersed kind of in the natural world in some fashion, even if you live in an urban environment. And there's tons of great benefits just to being outside and being in the natural world anyways. It tends to lower cortisol rates. There's also these little like floating immune cells called phytoncides that emit from plants. But the real trick here is to do everything you can to ensure foundational sleep by getting outside. Okay, so that's number one. Number two and number three is I have sort of a contrast bathing regimen in the morning, and this is actually not always free because not everybody has a sauna available to them. But pretty much everyone can get cold just in a cold shower. So that is something that I do, and there's many, many good reasons for that, which I'm happy to break down at some juncture. And then I would say move and lift heavy things, and this can be literally as simple as walking. And just get into the gym a few times a week and work all of your major muscle groups. Now, there can be we can get into a lot of specificity around that, but again, it's a lot of it is just kind of thinking about your health through the question or the lens of how did I evolve? I evolved moving all the time. My hunter-gatherer ancestors walked 7 to 10 miles per day on average. So that's 14,000 to 20,000 steps, more or less, if you're counting on your iWatch or something.
Right.
And they lifted heavy things, they chopped wood and carried water and built structures. And so you want to align with your evolution. And, we have 45,000 gyms in the United States now. That's a crazy number. 45,000.
But yet there's still people that obviously are not using them.
Obesity rates have tripled since the 1970s. And so something's not working. Yep. That equation is not making sense. And for me, I will say personally, I productized exercise. I sort of commodified it for most of my life. It was like this 45-minute period of atonement that sat in my calendar at the end of the day. And I would then, dutifully go to the gym to repent for all my sins and, slog it out on the treadmill for 45 minutes. I call that sort of chronic cardio. That simply does not work. I just don't see it working for people. I think that, we need to get into zone 5 a couple times a week. We need to walk like crazy. It's zone 2 exercise. We need to lift heavy things. But even more than that, we need to change our whole framework around exercise and not treat it as this one little fluorescent blob in your Google Cal, but actually integrate movement in and throughout our day. Take numerous short walks, drop and do a couple of push-ups, do some air squats. It's called, of course, now we have a fancy rubric for it, which I think is neat, non-exercise activity thermogenesis or something like that. But it's really just integrating movement organically throughout your day. And again, of course, because that's how we evolved. We evolved moving throughout the day. So, these are things that we can do for absolutely free.
Yeah.
And again, it does not take long to get on that upward spiral.
Yeah. And you're, like I mentioned, you're a testament to applying these protocols and what they've done to your life specifically, but it's obviously proof in other people's lives. Yeah. And I think the problem is the people that are stuck in their comfort zone and don't really, there's nothing driving them to do hard things. But yet, of course, if you care about your health, you need to endure some of these good stress protocols so that you won't have chronic stress, which is what we're trying to avoid. So as I mentioned, I wanted to circle back to one of the things I mentioned as far as being in community. And one of those things is I think a lot of people are so used to being isolated and not in community, especially because people are on social media and that's how they engage with people. And so I think one of those big struggles that people have is maybe they're more introverted. So they're, maybe they don't feel comfortable talking about comfort again, being in an environment where there's a lot of people. So what would you say to those people that are kind of avoiding community because, again, it's uncomfortable?
Yeah. Well, I think we're all pretty familiar with the impacts of like a physical fitness regimen. And this is kind of the most obvious demonstration of good stress. Like you go to the gym, you overload a biceps muscle, for example. What happens? Well, you micro tear the fibers in that muscle, and there's an immune response that's totally adaptive. And in response to that little bit of insult or injury, your body activates these structural proteins, myosin and actin, et cetera. And if your diet has protein in it, you give it a little bit of rest, what happens? It grows back bigger, right? That's muscle hypertrophy. And this is the most obvious, probably example of good stress, right? I think we have to apply that same framework to social fitness because of exactly what, you mentioned, Erica. It's like we are lonely and we're introverted. And because we actually can satisfy a lot of our biological needs, never leaving the house, right? We think that we can be thriving individuals separate from the world around us. But that just does not turn out to be true. Community is really a hardwired part of human health and happiness, period. I mean, I interviewed this guy, Robert Waldinger, who ran the longest longitudinal study on human happiness at Harvard. And I asked him, so he followed 258 people from 1938 throughout their whole lives. Well, he didn't just, but he was the director of this program. And I asked him, like, what is the number one determinant of health and happiness? And he said, without even a hesitation, the strengths of their social bonds and connections, period. So in this era of kind of digital warriorship and loneliness and social atomization and polarization, we now actually have to have a social fitness regimen that sort of mirrors our physical fitness regimen and push ourselves into social interaction where that was just commonplace, as by dint of being alive, 100 years ago, but certainly thousands of years ago. So now we have to actually really look at that and say, okay, instead of just sending my, anyone who calls me to voicemail and engaging in endless text, like pick up the phone when someone who loves calls you. It's little things, simple as that. Engage in service. That's a big one. If we can actually engage in public service or philanthropy, oftentimes that actually puts us in these really wonderful and fulfilling and interesting social interactions. I'm big into actually leaning into stressful conversations. This was a big part of actually my personal journey and my personal growth. We tend to want to avoid any conversation that seems hard or thorny. We run away in the other direction, or we just, devolve into, ad hominem or insults. But, there is actually a method for leaning into hard and stressful conversations. And there's a lot of beauty on the other side of those.
Yeah.
So I think, just in the way that you need to achieve hormonal balance, there is a social homeostasis that is available to people that I think represents kind of the healthiest way to be socially, which is this kind of combination between some degree of introvertedness. Like you want to be comfortable in your own skin and be happy and contented when you're alone and find creative outlet and peace and stillness. And then on the same time, you also want to be very comfortable, quote unquote, in the good way, within social situations and feel that sensation of connectedness And so I have this word that I call an ambivert. So the ambivert is sort of this balance between the extrovert and the introvert. Someone that is totally happy and functional being within groups, but then can also find, peace and serenity and equipoise in their aloneness, in their chosen aloneness.
Yeah,
And that's
definitely
there's actually a real big difference between loneliness and chosen solitude.
Absolutely. Jeff, there's so much we could go into. There's so much more I would love to dive in this conversation. But I know everybody needs to grab your book because like you said, the protocols you talk about are life-changing. I know some of them, even I read your book, it's amazing book. And there's such a wealth of information, but even some of it was confronting for me, like the engaging in hard conversations, the social aspect, because I've become like more, I'm like a introvert extrovert, and I've become more introvert, and maybe, a little bit was confronting for me, like ways that I could step outside my comfort zone as well. And I just think it was really beneficial book to read. And I know it could serve a lot of people today. So I just thank you for everything you shared today. So I'll just ask you my closing question. I ask everybody, if you were to share a piece of wisdom that you feel everybody needs to hear right now and you need to shout it out to the world, what would that piece of wisdom be and why?
Yeah. I think we all are seeking a life of ease, but really of true ease. Like I said before, snuggling on the couch and binging Netflix and eating Ben and Jerry's can from time to time be amazing. But it's not truly that life that we seek. What we seek is a life of connection, like the one we're having right now, where we feel like a sense of true ease. And that true ease is often available in creative immersion, or sometimes like collective enterprise, like when you're doing something with a group that's really important. Sometimes we get a glimpse of it, like when we're playing sports. Sometimes we call that flow state, where you have perfect awareness of your body in space and time. And you almost can intuit the next thing that's going to happen, that you tap into this sort of like foundational brilliance and intelligence of your body. And you can even taste it. Like, I'm sure you've gone in your life and bought like an ethylene gassed tomato from the grocery store, and you bite into it and it tastes like watery nothing. And then on the contrary, you've also gone to your backyard garden and gotten that tomato and bit into that, and it is a completely different world. It's efflorescent and juicy and fecund and sweet and everything that you want in your life. But that ease doesn't come for free. Like, you had to cultivate that soil. You had to plant that seed. You had to tend it. You had to make sure it got enough water. You had to prune the leaves at the right time. And through all of that inconvenience, something truly beautiful emerged. And that's the true ease that we're seeking. So that's my thesis. That's my message, is that the real life that we're seeking actually involves leaning in to a little bit of inconvenience and discomfort.
Amazing, Jeff. I love this conversation. Thank you so much for your time. Appreciate you.
Thanks, Erica.